Hey guys and welcome to a video about Honkai Star Rail. I was fortunate enough to be contacted by Hoyoverse and be given access to the final closed beta. So for the past few days, I have been pushing the content in the beta test and learning everything about it. So today, I will be going over everything you need to know about Honkai Star Rail's combat system to see if this is the right one for you. We will cover the basics, go over the important things surrounding combat, and if I think this has endgame potential. I will also be making a lot of comparisons to Genshin because they are very similar in a lot of ways. And I know that a lot of you are familiar with Genshin, so it will also make it easier for you to understand how each of the systems work. With that said, if you find this video useful, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and let's jump right in. First up, let's go over the basics. Just like I said, in a lot of ways, this game is very similar to Genshin. For one, this game makes use of a team that consists of 4 characters, and each of the characters can have one of the 7 types, which is basically the equivalent of elements in Genshin Impact. But one of the major differences is that physical is one of the categories in Star Rail. Another major difference is that Honkai Star Rail doesn't actually have any elemental reactions. You have skill effects like freeze and burn, but those are effects from passive skills or from one of the buffs in the simulated universe, which is basically the equivalent of the Spiral Abyss. Honkai Star Rail also has something called the Path, which in simple terms are the classes where each of the characters are categorized as. Each one has a very specific description, so it's easy to understand how the characters in each path is meant to be used. Now moving on to the actual combat itself, you will be encountering different enemies while exploring different areas, as well as in the Calyx, which is basically the ley lines, as well as in the main story. The combat in Star Rail will be very familiar if you have played JRPGs, because it's basically the same style. You can start a battle by attacking the enemy with a normal attack or a skill, and if you attack using the element that the enemy is weak against, you will start the battle with the enemy's toughness bar heavily decreased. This is important to do because you will have an easier time doing a weakness break, which will basically let you have an easier time in the fight. So make sure that you always initiate the battle and not the enemy, because if the enemy initiates the fight, the battle will start in an ambushed state where the enemy gets to do their attacks first before you do. After you enter a battle, your characters will act in a sequence depending on their speed stat. So your character with the highest speed will have their turn first, and the one with the least will go last. More often than not, your team will have the first move and you have quite a lot of options. You can do a normal attack which will do a bit of damage, and it will also give you 1 point towards your skill point meter. You can get up to maximum of 5, but you normally start with 3 skill points, not unless you have a special passive that will let you start with 4. For most cases, you wouldn't want to start with the normal attack because you have more than enough skill points to work with. So your best option will be using your skill. Using a skill consumes 1 skill point. That's why it's important to manage your skill points properly so that you can use the skill that you need whenever you want. Personally, I use my first rotation to set up all the important buffs and effects to mitigate the incoming damage from the enemy's first move, and at the same time, maybe decrease the enemy's toughness bar using some characters. Another option you have is to use the character's ultimate. How this works is that when using an ultimate, it will not end the character's turn, and you can actually use this whenever you want regardless of whose turn it is. So for characters like Bailu who can heal her team using her burst, this can be very clutch in a lot of situations. But before you can use your ultimate, you have to wait until it's fully charged. Some ultimates take longer to charge than others, but all of them are charged in the same way. You will either have to use a basic attack, use a skill, defeat enemies, or it can also be charged by some character passives and light cone effects. Moving on, let's take a look at the enemies and how the element system works in combat. Once you encounter an enemy, they will all have your standard HP bar as well as a toughness bar. The HP bar is pretty straightforward, so I want to focus more on the toughness. This one is the white bar on top of your enemy's HP, and this can only be damaged by the elements that the enemy is weak to. So if you attack an enemy with an element that they are weak against, it will deal damage to both their HP and their toughness. But if you use an element that they are not weak against, it will only affect their HP. So knowing that, it's important to use the right element on the right enemy so that you can quickly break their toughness meter. Breaking their toughness will let you deal more damage to them because of the weakness break effect. This will apply different effects depending on the element that you use to break their toughness. Breaking it with fire will let you deal more fire damage to the enemy, as well as applying a burn effect. And the same thing goes with lightning, physical, and wind, also letting you deal more damage corresponding to the same element, and applying damage over time with the same element type. Ice on the other hand will freeze the enemy, which means that they won't be able to do any moves on top of an ice type damage over time. And the other unique ones are Quantum and Imaginary. Quantum applies an entanglement effect which basically delays the enemy's turn and applies the damage over time. And Imaginary applies imprisonment which delays the enemy's order on top of reducing their speed. With that said, the enemy will recover their toughness meter during their next turn. So it's important to set up your attacks properly so that you can deal as much damage as possible while they are in the weakness break state. And while we are in the topic of status effects, the effects that a character has will be indicated by an icon below their HP. And the same thing goes with the enemies. Pressing C or simply clicking on the enemies tab will send you to the details screen. Here is where you will see the different stats and skills for both your characters and enemies, and this is important not just for knowing which status effects everyone has, but also for knowing how much shield you have left. In the combat screen, there is an indicator which shows that the character has a shield, but it doesn't tell you how much shield you have left. So I hope that they maybe put the shield value beside the HP number or something, so that you don't have to check the details tab every time you want to know how much shield you have left. Early into the game, the combat is pretty simple, and then they will slowly introduce different features and mechanics along the way. You will first be going up against one group of enemies at a time, and then you will be introduced to stages with multiple waves. You will also be able to unlock fast forward in the autoplay feature. This is nice to have because you can just sit back when farming materials. But I do want to mention that the autoplay feature will not be available for some stages, particularly in the main story. I also hope that they introduce a feature where it doesn't automatically use the ultimate, because in my experience, the AI just uses the ultimate even if it doesn't make sense to use it yet. As you progress further into the game, they will introduce more enemy mechanics like a taunt, where you are forced to attack a specific enemy. And there will also be a stage where the enemy can disable one random character in your team by basically taking them as hostage. I'm sure that there are a lot more mechanics that will be introduced along the way, but now let's move on to what I think of the combat system as a whole. To make things simple, let's put it this way. The high points of Honkai Star Rail's combat is very engaging and very fun, so I'm talking about things like the simulated universe, which is basically the Spiral Abyss, and the different bosses that you encounter in the story. But the combat outside of that is really not that good. I don't know if I'm over-leveled, maybe the game is too easy for me or whatever reason, but the fights outside of the bosses are not very engaging, so I just end up using autoplay if I can, and not really playing the game. This can be good or bad depending on the person you're talking to, because some people want to have a challenging experience when it comes to combat, and some people want a more casual gameplay experience. But knowing hoyoverse, they will most likely target the more casual audience just like what they did in the past. So I would say that if you are going into this game expecting a challenge, then expect those challenges to not come very often. This game will feel a lot like Genshin in a sense that things will only feel like a challenge not because the difficulty increased, but because you hit a certain threshold in your progression, and the only way to beat the harder content is not to necessarily be better at the game, but to farm more and get more upgrades or spend more money. Also, considering that this is a turn-based game, there is really not much they can do to make harder content, at least in terms of the mechanics and not just upping the numbers on the enemy. So overall, Star Rail's combat is not for the hardcore players who are looking for a challenge, especially if you are free to play. If history repeats itself, they will just end up introducing more content that will give you problems, and they will try to sell you the solution. If you are still set on playing this game, just know that this will be more of a casual waifu collector game where you will most likely end up spending money on. And me saying that is not just some crazy random assumption. You can watch this video of the CEO saying that this is their goal from the very beginning. I will still be playing Star Rail, but not because of the combat. I really like the character designs and I think that the story is pretty good. So I'm playing this game on the side because of that. With that said, do let me know what you guys think about the game's combat system, and as always, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.